All right, Jared. So, tell me a little bit about your artistic practice. We talked a little bit about artistic practice earlier in the presentation, and um, what's remarkable to me is the fact that you were sharing how you can be making something and then something starts to come out or something starts to manifest, and you sort of set your coordinates. You see where things go, things start to manifest, and you sort of go with the flow of what's being created while your item is actually being printed. I never would have thought that that was a component or that was an aspect of 3D printing, because I thought it was very regimented. Like, you make your file and then it prints out and it's a wrap. But if I understand correctly, you're saying that sometimes things come out in ways that you weren't necessarily expecting, or you get your print and you sort of veer off into another direction. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, it's
a
a
kind of
kind of
a
a
little
little
evolving
evolved.
process it turns into, at least with my art and the way I end up doing things. And a lot of times, because I have the background of like more traditional artwork, I'm thinking a lot of times in that process. But as my time, has over time working at Moddler, I've begun to think more of like, in the parameters of 3D printing's capabilities and having more of an engineering, like, mindset to achieve certain things. And so it ends up being this kind of cool process where, maybe I'll draw out an object, I'll see it in 2D, it's an illustration, and I kind of start to think, okay, in 3D, what is this going to look like? And sometimes I'll start actually sculpting part of it with clay or something like that. And then I'll be like, I think I want to do this hand 3D printed. And so, there's a ton of these like back and forth things that end up happening where I'll print something out and I'll notice that, maybe I want this little tweak done on it. And so then I go back to clay and I actually make something in clay and stick it on the 3D print. Or sometimes I realize in the 3D print that I want to add something else that wasn't there before, and I'll 3D print another piece and add that on the 3D print. You start to get this really cool evolving process where, at least for me, you're hopping back and forth between, traditional art and digital art and, 3D printing and playing this kind of repetitive loop between figuring out what the idea is and how to make it manufacturable with the parameters of the 3D print, and how to make things really just, I mean, the end goal is to make something interesting and beautiful. So, it's another tool to achieve that, and having that kind of at your expense to find out, what is the best path to make this feature or object or piece in general is really great. And the other really fun thing about being part of Modeler is that I get to see other people's artistic processes and how they achieve different things. And a lot of times, like I said before, it's people with this idea in their head and they want to make it into something that exists and is physical, and they don't really know how to do that. And I get to play a little bit of a role and hear how they're thinking and how they're going about their piece as it is and what they're trying to achieve, and then lend a hand in that process to make this thing a reality. And so a lot of it's, simultaneously, I'm helping out this person and this artist, but I'm actually learning for my own use at the same time. And so, and I'm simultaneously giving them ideas and ways to improve or achieve something down the road. And it's a learning experience for everybody involved. And that's the really fun part about the artistic projects, is that there's usually no straight path forward, and it's figuring out, with the tools that you have, how to best achieve that thing. So, yeah, it's a great tool, and it's, again, it really opens up a lot of doors for different possibilities that weren't there before.
So, can you talk a little bit about the materials that are available for 3D printing? I see some that are more like squishy rubbery, some that are harder plastic, which is more like the piece that you guys created for me. But can you talk a little bit about some of the materials that are available?
Yeah, the materials actually of 3D printing are one of the coolest things about 3D printing, especially in modern day. I mean, at this point, 3D printing's probably, I think, been around for like 20 years or more. And Modeler got in right when we started to see that it was really viable for making beautiful pieces. And so that's kind of where we were like, okay, this is like 3D printing went from a conceptual thing to something that's actually useful. I used the idea of like printing a coffee mug, and while there are still limitations to that kind of stuff based off materials, um, the avenues and usefulness of 3D printing is skyrocketing. I mean, we saw during like COVID, all the people that had 3D printers in their garage printing medical supplies for people that we had a shortage on. That was like the perfect case of usefulness of a 3D printer. Um, But it expands way beyond that, and it will continue to. And a big thing about that is materials. It's like, what can you actually make this thing out of? And so right now, most of the advances in 3D printing are in material sciences. And for your object, Tracy, or for your piece, we use the material that's called ABS. The reason we use that piece is it's actually really good right now for doing really big structurally sound parts. And what I mean by that is they're just strong. They're able to do pieces that are large. One of the big issues that is with 3D printing still is just a size limitation. I mean, there definitely are people that are 3D printing buildings and stuff like that, but that's really few and far between. And the availability of materials there is pretty much cement or something like that. And so as the materials progress, so do the machines. ABS, again, for instance, this instance was like the perfect material to use for the object. It finishes well. You can actually sand it. You can paint it. You can do all sorts of stuff with it. So, and it's not the kind of material that you drop on the ground and it shatters. So that's great. You can actually handle it.
But are there advancements towards like being able to 3D print glass and being able to 3D print actual metal, or utilize materials like sand or mud in a 3D printing context?
Yeah, absolutely. The materials have gone, basically for at least the extrusion type of 3D printing, which we use to do this piece for you, Tracy, was it's called FDM, so fused deposit modeling, which means it just gets extruded like a hot glue gun and then it solidifies. So a lot of times anything that you can heat up or have in a liquid form that will jet out and then solidify, you can 3D print. So people do that with clay, people can do that with mud, with cement. There's all sorts of also like composites that people make that are a mixture of different materials. So for instance, like for jewelry, a lot of people need like wax resin pieces that can be used for burnout molds. So it's a mixture of wax and resin, and when you heat it to a certain temperature, it melts out. So you can use it as a master repository for mold making. There's biomaterials that are your body will accept, that people will 3D print things in that can actually go inside your body. There's stuff that is just like more FDA approved skin safe stuff that you could use for a utensil or something like that. So you can really get into, and metals. Metals is a new advancement too. It's still kind of in its early, infancy of for 3D printing, but it is getting more and more useful, and people use it for all sorts of parts that were never capable of being manufactured before.
Nice. So tell me a little bit about your experience with creating this piece, the slave collar, is what I'm referring to it as. But it's essentially a chattel slavery era torture device, and you don't hear people referring to it as such typically, but that's what it is. So I want to make sure I give it a name that is consistent with the reality of the thing. But tell me a little bit about your experience with creating this piece.
Over the years, I mean, like I said, working with a number of artists, so we get all sorts of projects come through the door that are, some of them are, like I said, some of it's just boring prototype pieces that are nondescript pieces. Some of them are really, intricate and insane looking pieces. And some of them, like this one, just have a lot to say revolving, around them. They're pieces to be discussed. And those tend to be some of the most fun pieces to work on, because it's not just about this object. It's about the idea behind the object, or what this piece is, what that object says. When Tracy, when you approached me about it, I immediately was like, what are you saying with this piece? There's a lot of heat around something like this, of course, especially in 2020 with another civil rights movement. It's a piece that is a big conversational piece that you can, people are going to look at and take away a number of things from, and sort of, hearing, your artistic process and the things you're trying to say with this piece is definitely powerful. I mean, there's a lot going on to it, and the fact that it's not just a slave collar, you're saying, basically a huge commentary about it, and you're putting your own twist on the slave collar to say your particular narrative or point, and it evolves from just me seeing an email come through that like, hey, I'm trying to make a slave collar, into a whole different thing that is exciting, and it's cool to see, and And for me, working on the piece, it's kind of I'm playing two parts, which is here's this piece that again needs to look beautiful, and how do I manufacture this piece? And so a lot of that was just figuring out, I kind of ended up like just on Google looking up slave collars, and that led me into just understanding what they were used for, how they were being made, who was making them, and that is, there's all sorts of, you just read horror stories, number one, and kind of can see like what these were originally being made for, and it's just like there's so many um, there's so many things that I felt like are still going on today that are, maybe it's not a slave collar in its physical form, but they're very similar in another, in that same way, depending on what it is, if it's an idea or something somebody's saying, or what that is. The same concept as a slave collar is really evident all over the place. And then going into that and kind of seeing like, okay, if these were made of, maybe these were made of iron, maybe they were, metal hammered, all these different things. And maybe and a lot of these things were like one-off custom made. So somebody was putting a lot of time into making this thing, which says a lot about the whole thing to begin with, is that anytime somebody is really putting their time and energy and a lot of it into something, it gives it power, and not always good. It's not always positive.
Right, and they were typically made on the plantation or in the space where they were being applied. So it's just that um, thought about making it, who was making these things. A lot of times, enslaved humans were also the smiths, people who were also being held hostage on these death camps that we also call plantations. They were making these things and having this collar affixed to your body. Like, it was very just the reading the firsthand accounts of it, but even just sort of from an empathetic standpoint, thinking about the experience of being the person who makes this and what trauma that held for them, and being the person who is actually having this affixed to you, and what it means, because now you tried to run away, you didn't necessarily succeed. That's, just reading those narratives was really a rough part of this, the experience for me, in working with this piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that like I never thought about from the point of the slave collar was, it's, I saw it as like a nuisance, or a way that like it is hard to do anything with this on you. But after reading more about it, it was actually a huge humiliation tactic. It was supposed to be embarrassing and really obvious that it was on somebody, and that's a whole other, avenue of this that I didn't really see before. Um, and coming down to manufacturing this thing, you think about that a lot too, because it went from me just seeing pictures of a slave collar to then having a physically to scale slave collar made. They were big, and I mean, I'm making a 3D printed plastic piece, but imagining that size of the thing being metal and on you would be extremely heavy.
And being heavy and also infecting your skin. A lot of people got these horrible infections where their skin swelled up, and they were, and they had to remove it, but it was like a horrible, infectious situation. And then just it being cumbersome and heavy. Because I have cast iron frying pans that I got, that I inherited from my grandmother, and just the pan is heavy. So I can't imagine wearing something like this on your collarbone, on your shoulders. But praise God, people were still very determined, and a lot of people had these. They ran away. So you see these advertisements where folks are like, "This person is wearing a collar," so they were like, you cannot hold me back." And I love that sort of. That was the encouraging part of the story, where people were like, "I don't care. You can put this thing on my neck, but you cannot continue to hold me in bondage." And I'm hoping that the folks who, in modern times are fixing these to themselves will also, break their own chains of mental bondage and release themselves from, from that hold. But yeah, I think I'll be interested to see, like, once it's finished, the public reaction to it, because I think it'll definitely
Uh,
be, it'll definitely generate some conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So it's about like having a piece that you're saying, but people are taking different things away. And then and the nice the nice thing about being you sort of in a sense lose control of that. And that can be a good thing. It's it lets people, you can only say so much, and then somebody's going to take away what they want from it. But by embedding this idea and putting this idea out there, you're helping people to think about ways they may be enslaving themselves, people are enslaved, where that metaphorical collar exists in their lives, maybe.
Exactly. And I will say that I'm a bossy artist in that I am very clear about what I have to say. And when you look at whatever I produce, you're going to see what I said, because it's important to me for people to hear my voice and my perspective in my art, but more important is for me to just share that perspective. Hopefully folks will hear it, but the reality is about the sharing part. But like you said, there's always going to be that space for people to arrive at their own conclusions and their own impressions and learn their own things from it. So I think this is a good time for us to shift to our live Q&A, and I bet we have a number of great questions coming up. So we're going to shift to the Q&A now.